Hello, very beautiful community. We are going to do a semi-blitz Q&A about what we can responsibly discuss about Ukraine's incursion into Kursk and about your own epistemic process following a story like that is developing with many elements that are unknown and unknowable until they come to light. Questions that we have that have repeated themselves in different DM boxes. Why didn't you discuss Ukraine's purposes in your main channel video about this? Are you seeing this positively, neutrally, or negatively for Ukraine? What's the Russian propaganda doing? Why isn't Gerasimov fired yet? How far can Putin go on pretending this is not a big deal? Is there a correlation between how long Ukraine spends in Kursk and regime fragility for Putin? Why are the people in Kursk Oblast so clueless? How do you think of the Russian opposition's reaction to this, and what should their reaction be? Will Putin use Kursk to turn the special military operation into a war? Could he do another wave of mobilization? Is this the liberation of the People's Republic of Kursk? And then I'll make a brief comment on Margaliotti's discussion today, and it was his pod about how you survive as an expert and commentator responsibly in the world of the gamification of war. So let's do this. Ukraine's purposes. Well, the best military experts have been cautious to express pessimism or optimism about this. We're going to have to wait more and see how their perspective percolates as the evidence before our eyes develops, and they'll be able to tell us things like whether this is helping Russia in Donetsk or hurting Russia in Donetsk, and how in military terms to understand what gain and benefit here for Ukraine might look like. That's premature, and when that develops, that's not a conversation that's going to come from me. But let's, after all, raise some possible political purposes, which I didn't raise in the main channel video, because I wanted ethically to even stay out of going there and give a general essay on the symbolism of this in the light of the long-distance self-immolation of the Putin regime. But let's speculatively raise some purposes. And the three I want to pick are the three that Margalioti raised in his pod today. And they are change of narrative in the West, in Ukraine, redefinition of the rules of engagement. Oh, is this allowed now from the Western point of view? Humiliation of Putin. Change of narrative. Now, from the West's point of view, the dynamic, if we were to caricaturally summarize it, is that the West is tending toward stopping the war, but isn't seeing a path to do it, but is tending that way, but isn't seeing how to get either Russia or Ukraine to do it. Because Ukraine is stuck with lots of unsustainable options of cessation of war that may lead to more war later and may indeed be incompatible with Ukraine's economic survival. So Ukraine doesn't want to take any options like that, and Putin either doesn't want negotiations or wants them as a means of winning the war later. And so the West is wanting to bring this to a close. We're saying something very caricatural, generalizing across many centers of power. But while some of the pieces for that are in place, some other very critical pieces are not. And we did a main channel video a couple of weeks ago on the unsustainability of fatuous demands for forcing Ukraine to the negotiating table. In light of this, could this boost confidence in the West in Ukraine's capacity for efficaciousness and surprise? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Now, that doesn't tell us anything about whether this venture from Ukraine is going to be cumulatively successful or not, but certainly that's a respect in which it would carry some success unless it really flatlined badly over the next days and weeks. Boost morale in Ukraine also, yes, right? Doesn't tell us anything cumulatively, but yes, this boosts morale in Ukraine undeniably, because Ukraine is stuck with a manpower issue, big manpower issue, and it's stuck between a narrative of victory that is unsustainable and a narrative of victory that is not yet developed. The first narrative of victory that's unsustainable is the one that's around the reacquisition of all territories, that carries nearly insuperable obstacles now. But the basic thing to say about it is that that's just not something that Western powers support. So if it somehow happened, it would happen despite what the West wants, not because of what the West wants. But what's Ukraine's sort of civically acceptable vision of victory if it's not to be full territorial liberation, right? That's not quite available yet in Ukrainian public discourse properly. So Ukraine's in a very difficult place, and this absolutely constitutes a major boost. Whether it knocks morale in Russia, we'll say a little bit about later, because it comes up in other questions. Redefinitions of rules of engagement, yeah, absolutely. In the sense that this happens and then the West has to react, and it's bound to react by saying, well, okay, then you did this, so okay. And this has a disinhibiting effect without doubt on the West's openness to Ukraine doing things it was previously not open to supporting Ukraine to do. However, there isn't going to be a fundamental shift there. And on some issues, there's a very blunt ceiling on, how much transformation we might see. And that one major example of that is nuclear escalation, right? The view that Ukraine wants the United States to take of nuclear escalation, the United States will never take. Just impossible, and would be completely indecent for the United States to do it, because it's central for the US government to minimize the chances of its citizens needing to be involved in a global nuclear exchange. And the United States isn't itself involved in an existential war of survival where you're happy to elevate risks of bad things happening in the world. So the difference between the Biden and the Harris administration on nuclear non-escalation, if there is one, it's going to be between having that as a first, second, third, fourth, and fifth priority, which is what it was for Biden, to just having it as a first and second priority. So I could see a shift there. We're going to fear nuclear Armageddon a bit less, but it's still going to be the central US priority, and there's nothing Ukraine can do to displace that. That's just not going to happen. Humiliating Putin is something that I think comes up in other questions. And the problem there, as Mark Galeotti quite rightly said, well, you embarrass Putin and so what? He's not going to melt away as a result of it. And nobody will eat him up as a result of that. And could it not be that Putin benefits from this in some way? And I'm actually skeptical about this, because for him to benefit, he would need to use it for various purposes of mobilizing society. But that is precisely what he is still keen to keep doing very incrementally. Do I see it positively or negatively for Ukraine? Well, if this turns out to be a a success, cumulative success for Ukraine, then that's going to be obviously very positive. At the same time, Ukraine's only engaging in this because things are going badly. So Ukraine is not doing this out of an excess of comfort. It is doing this out of a heavy dose of difficulty and desperation. What's Russian propaganda saying about this? TV propaganda is trying to play it down. Nothing to see here. We just invaded our neighbor and then they re-invaded us back. And we've evacuated 76,000 people. But there is nothing to see. And we don't control some of our own territory, but there is nothing to see. And that is a direct reproduction of the Kremlin message. But the military bloggers are more plural and exercised and chaotic in their response, with much ventilation about the chaos in the region, the abandonment of the region by the central power. And there is even a little bit of talk about, which is a kind of another symbolic expression of Russia's borderlessness. There's a call or two for using tactical nuclear weapons on Russia's own territory in the military blogosphere. Why isn't Gerasimov fired yet? If this goes very well for Ukraine, and I'm Gerasimov, I'm concerned. How far can Putin go on pretending that this is not a big deal? Is there a correlation between how long Ukraine spends in Kursk and regime stability? Yes, of course there is. At the same time, there is another question about whether Putin can use this to politicize and mobilize society further. So maybe we'll just transfer that question onto that other one. What I can say is that at the level of the population, this is not a big deal as things stand. Well, there's some war going on somewhere, and there's some skirmishes across the border that are coming into Russian territory. Well, what do you expect? There's a war going on, and we don't know why it's going on, but we trust there might be some good reasons for the Kremlin to prosecute it, even though we don't know what we are. We're not in politics. That's the preponderant response. I mean, there's lots of micro problems there for Putin, such as the fact that, he's promised to not use the conscripted kids to engage in military combat, direct combat, and because the wars come onto Russian soil, the big themes of our talks over a couple of years now, and it'll continue. Putin is going to face blowback from that to some extent, from the families of these conscripted kids, as they are one group among others used to try to stop the Ukrainian incursion. But I don't see any big population reaction on the basis of the situation we've got today. Why are people in Kursk so clueless? I won't re-legislate what I've said in the main channel video, which is that there's this extraordinarily deep state of depoliticization that can only shift if there's an actionable alternative that is perceived to be available. And only if that is the case will people begin to think. It's not going to be the other way around. It's not that they're going to think and then act. They're going to have to discover an avenue for action, preferably with some vision and some leadership involved there, which is not on the cards at all at the moment. And if that were on the card, then they'd begin to, if you like, wake up normatively and think, well, let's piece this together. Why is this happening to us? Oh, it's because we did this. My advice when you observe such a unlovely and catastrophic collapse of cause and effect thinking about politics, right? I mean, you look at pictures coming out of that region, it's people saying, well, why us? What did we do? I mean, you're doing some operation across the border, seems to be liberatory. What have we got to do with it, with this? Why are we victims now? So that is a catastrophic collapse in cause and effect thinking. But when we encounter extreme cultural pathologies, it's very helpful to say, look, we don't have that here in such an extreme way, but don't we have milder versions of this of similar pathology here at home too, right? Don't we ourselves have many citizens who think about politics outside of cause and effect? I think that's a helpful avenue in which to travel. What do I think about the Russian opposition reaction? And what should it be? Well, I am not civically, right? I don't civically feel at all Russian, so I can't ethically go on too long telling these folks what to do. I'm not in touch with any of them. But there have been three reactions. The first reaction is go, 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 Ukraine. The second reaction is this is horrific, but we've brought it upon ourselves. And we need to recognize that Ukraine's military wouldn't be there unless we invaded them 10 years ago and then in a full-scale manner 2.5 years ago. And the third reaction, more minority support reaction, is you can never wish your country harm. And about that reaction, all I have to say is that it might be as much as you can get away with in Russia. Because if you go further, then definitely going to be in trouble. But putting personal safety risks aside, I don't recognize that the reaction like that is sufficiently radical in proportion to the radical nature of the situation. In other words, you have to wish your country defeat if you're serious about this, if you're a serious oppositioner, because otherwise you can't tell a story of who's fighting who and what it means to be on one side rather than the other. What's it mean to, on the ex-Soviet space, oppose this obscurantist, authoritarian imperialist revolution. So therefore, you've got to take the radical position. But what's hard, you've got to take it patriotically. You've got to sound patriotic, but wish your country defeat. So that's a very difficult balance for them to strike. They've got to strike it, right? Imagine trying to tell, there's plenty of disanalogies, of course, between these conflicts, but imagine trying to tell US citizens during the Iraq war, who we wanted to persuade that that was a bad war, that they're nothings and nobodies. No, you want to elevate them and say, well, this is not American, right? This is not what America is all about. So the Russian opposition have to say, we love our country, but loving our country means defeat in this case, opting for defeat. So that's the difficult balance, but you can't sneak out of it unless you're just doing it for personal security reasons by saying you can never wish your country harm. I'm afraid that's just not a radical enough position, given the radical nature of the challenge the Russian opposition faced. That's my thought on that. Will Putin use Kursk to turn the special military operation into a war? Could Russian society mobilize? So, yes and no. Putin is balancing depoliticization with politicization, with a drift toward politicization. You've seen this in our discussion of propaganda on the main channel, how some of Putin's propaganda has now become Soviet-style alternate reality propaganda, while most of it still remains post-truth propaganda. You are seeing this with the radical transformation of the education system, what I call the fascization of the education system. And not accidentally, because you want to talk about fascization when it's not just war that's being propagated, but war as an end in itself and a form of self-expression. What you are going to see is more tightness around the borders, incremental closure of the borders, incremental attempts to shut off the internet, and 3 more waves of terror, such that the way the population is picked up repressively by the regime is going to become less pointillistic, and there's going to be more of the regime eating itself up. We've seen quite a bit of the regime eating itself up already, but we haven't seen anything yet compared to what we are going to see over the next few years. So that's going to happen. But no, that doesn't mean that Putin needs to take any radical steps now, unless Ukraine's incursion somehow ends up going really horrifically for him. So he absolutely doesn't want a second wave of mobilization equivalent to what he did in autumn 2022. If he did that, I bet he'd get away with it. But it would be a wobbly and wonky enterprise for him to engage in. Now, some quick remarks now on responsibility. So at the end of his pod today, Mark Galeotti said, look, let me talk briefly about responsibility and being sort of epistemically adequate, in my terms, not Mark's. And Mark said, look, I was, doing this short reaction piece for The Spectator of 800 words, and I was very conscious of how much there is that we don't know and we can't say. But journalists want from you clear-cut reactions. They want clear-cut positive reactions that cheerlead the side that folks support. But short of that, they want clear reactions. And sometimes you can't do that. So this is Mark talking about what it means to be a responsible commentator, to speculate responsibly in the world of the gamification of war. And I actually think Mark is as good as anyone at coming in the very moment something is happening and then offering insight, but also speculating about it responsibly. Well, let me add my couple of cents on this, maybe with a principle and then with a little bit of a personal comment about how I frame my last YouTube video from this point of view of ethics and responsibility. And the reason that's really important isn't because I'm going to say something fascinating or revolutionary. It's because experts, commentators, public intellectuals, broadcasters, whatever, need to have, once a month, let's say, visceral dialogue with their own community about trust. Right? Trust isn't something that you get a kind of a stamp for. Boom, you've got it. No, it's always a process of mutual exploration and sort of reconnection between you and me. So how I handled the main channel video was that I chose to omit not just speculating on the military aspects of this, which I never do, but even speculating on Ukraine's political purposes. So I used it as an opportunity to tell a more long-distance story about how this incursion genuinely revealed, not just at a symbolic level, but also at a symbolic level, this extraordinary, borderless imperial project engaged in a long-distance process of self-immolation, about which we shouldn't party, because that's never good, and it's possible for the self-immolation to occur in a way that brings a lot of other places and countries down. So, Russia's self-immolation in 2043 is not good news, irrespective of how it happens. So, but that's the context in which I put it. And I felt that was the responsible line to take. And then the sticker I put on the video, and it's right to recognize that on YouTube, there is a culture of colorful and provocative stickers. So if you don't get that, you don't quite get YouTube. But I chose to say on the sticker, on the thumbnail, war on Russian soil, and later swapped that over to Ukraine invades Russia. I didn't put on the sticker Russia is collapsing, or Russia is crushed, or Russia is being destroyed, or Ukraine is having some spectacular success. What would have happened if I'd done that? I think it would have significantly changed the views. I mean, if you just need to, all you need to do is just look at Times Radio thumbnails, right? Their YouTube channel is largely grown by talk about Putin having some kind of calamity. So the benefit of that would have been that an extra 150,000 people would have seen my video. Very same video, very same analysis. And probably I would have had more, stuff in my inbox about wanting my comment and wanting to interview me. But on balance, I didn't feel right to use that language. And that's about, and here comes the ethical point, a maintenance of a rudder, right? Of being a responsible actor in the informational space. And for me, that really means two things, at least. Number one, that what I'm putting into your tummy is not junk food. It's not stuff you're happy to gobble up today, then you feel bad about tomorrow. Number one. Because I know you do some of that. I know you do some of the junk food behavior online. Some of you. Very few, almost none. Maybe none. Second, am I making a contribution that ethically contributes to tethering rather than detethering our democracies from the practiced virtue of truthfulness? And that rudder has to take different shapes for different people, right? Because I am presenting my platform very much as analysis and public intellectual commentary, which leaves available the space for me to come out and take a different view of circumstances change, right? As I'm not an activist pro-Ukraine channel, it's available to me to come out and say, I don't believe we should support Ukraine anymore because circumstances have changed and it'll destabilize our democracies too much. I'm not saying that because that's the wrong position in my judgment. But in principle, I would say it if I thought it was the right position. I couldn't say it if I was a pro-Ukraine activist. And so that is an important part of my ethics, right? So you've got to understand what kind of enterprise somebody is engaged in. You often see Tim Snyder being attacked by academics. In fact, most academics dislike what Tim Snyder is doing. But they're attacking him as though he's speaking like an academic historian, but he's just speaking as a public moralist. So if you're going to sort of judge somebody's ethics, make it accord with the hat that they're wearing, right? Because, quite frankly, I do think that a different thumbnail could be appropriate for an activist channel, right? That wouldn't be appropriate for me. So there we go. A final remark on this would be that before we get to the last question about Kursk Republic, a final remark on this would be that I believe we are lucky algorithmically to be in a very positive bubble. I'm very proud and very supportive of virtually everybody in our bubble. And that pleases me very much, and I often feel warmth when folks in the bubble hit particular milestones. So then we can be grateful about that, because to some extent it's arbitrary where you end up in the algorithm. Last remark. Is this a liberation of the People's Kursk Republic? No, it isn't. Why? Because unless we want to be imperialist like Mr. Putin, we have to say that what happens to people, right, is up to them, right, expressing a political voice, right? After the Putin regime collapses, Russia's going to face questions about what holds it together. We don't know how far it'll have the possibility to answer these questions constructively. But these questions will be there, and folks who live on that territory are going to have to give answers to such questions. And so it's a funny joke to declare the Kursk People's Republic, but it also risks looking unserious in the eyes of people who are skeptical about some of the positions you take, right? Who want to interrogate your pro-Ukrainian views, right? And you don't increase your chances of persuading them by talking in these terms, because these are quite frankly imperial terms in which to speak about people living on the territory, right? If you are a, I don't know, Swiss academic in New Zealand, you don't get to pronounce on what happens on Russian territory independently of the invocation of the will of people living there any more than you get to do that about Ukraine or any other country. If you want to know more about these sorts of debates, then don't do anything, because you've almost certainly watched it already. But in case there are some people who haven't seen my 20-minute video on the main channel legislating on the issues around this debate about the breakup of Russia, then I'll stick it up at the end of this video. Thank you for surviving this with me, and lots of love.